Do you remember those soul foods that used to bring comfort to every table? The ones you'd only spot in the worn pages of old cookbooks? These dishes carried stories, flavors, and traditions that nourished families through hard times and celebrations alike. From slow-simmered pots to sweet desserts made with little more than sugar and love, they were more than just recipes. They were memories. Today we're bringing back 30 forgotten soul foods you could only find in old cookbooks. Liver and onions. Few dishes in the soul food canon provoke such strong feelings as liver and onions. For some, it's the ultimate comfort meal, tied to the warmth of childhood kitchens and the patient hands of a grandmother who could take the most unglamorous cut of meat and turn it into something sustaining. For others, it's a memory of sitting stubbornly at the table, nose wrinkled, waiting for permission to leave a plate untouched. That's the funny thing about this dish. It never inspired indifference. You either loved it or you plotted ways to hide it in a napkin. Liver and onions rose to prominence during times when thrift mattered more than preference. Beef liver was cheap, nutrient-dense, and always available, even when prime cuts were too expensive or rationed. Cookbooks of the Great Depression and mid-century South regularly included recipes for frying or smothering liver, pairing it with a heaping helping of sautéed onions to soften its iron-strong flavor. It was a practical solution for families who needed protein on the table without stretching the budget. And with a bit of patience at the stove, it could be transformed from tough and bitter into something surprisingly tender. The preparation itself was straightforward. Slices of liver were dredged in flour, seasoned generously, then seared until browned. Onions were caramelized in the same skillet, their sweetness acting as a counterbalance to the liver's intensity. Gravy often followed, made from pan drippings and poured generously over both. It wasn't flashy, but it was filling, and for many families, that was what mattered most. Nostalgia clings to liver and onions because it represents more than just sustenance. It represents resilience, meals stretched from whatever was at hand, prepared with care and passed down as tradition. Sitting around the table, you could feel that it wasn't only about eating, it was about honoring the wisdom of making do. Today, liver has found its way back into trendy food circles under the label of nose-to-tail dining, where chefs praise the very cuts our grandparents saw as necessity. But for anyone who grew up with a plate of liver and onions, it was never about trends. It was about survival, family, and a flavor that could only come from cooking with heart. Chitlins. Chitterlings. If there is one dish that can clear a kitchen faster than smoke from a burnt roast, it's chitlins. Officially known as chitterlings, these are the cleaned and cooked intestines of a pig, a dish that has divided families, church suppers, and Sunday dinners for generations. For some, the mere mention brings back memories of holiday feasts, of pots bubbling away on the stove, and the unmistakable smell that filled the whole house. For others, it sparks an instant recoil, a not in my kitchen kind of response. And yet, despite the controversy, chitlins are one of the most enduring soul food traditions. The roots of chitlins trace back to the resourcefulness of enslaved Africans in the American South. Given the least desirable parts of the hog, they turned what others considered scraps into something deeply flavorful and meaningful. Over time, chitlins became a centerpiece of winter and holiday meals, a dish of celebration as much as survival. Families would gather together for the laborious process of cleaning, scrubbing, rinsing, and boiling for hours. It wasn't just cooking, it was a ritual, often shared across generations. Preparation required patience and toughness, both in spirit and in stomach. Once meticulously cleaned, chitlins were simmered with onions, vinegar, garlic, and spices to tame both flavor and aroma. When done right, they emerged tender, savory, and comforting, usually served with cornbread or hot sauce. The smell might linger in your curtains for a week, but to those who loved them, that was simply the scent of tradition. Nostalgia for chitlins runs deep because they represent more than food. They represent community, resilience, and the art of turning hardship into heritage. Families often cook them around the holidays, a reminder of their ancestors' perseverance and a time when nothing went to waste. Today, chitlins are less common on the average dinner table, often reserved for special occasions or found at soul food festivals. Modern diners may wrinkle their noses, but the truth is, chitlins embody a culinary creativity that deserves respect. What began as a meal of necessity now stands as a testament to culture, survival, and the power of making something out of nothing. Neckbones and gravy. There's a certain kind of magic in taking the humblest cut of meat and coaxing out a meal that feels like a feast. Neckbones and gravy are a perfect example of that kitchen sorcery. For decades, especially in the South, pork or beef neckbones were the definition of affordable, cheap, often overlooked by butchers, and exactly the kind of cut thrifty families knew how to transform. Where others saw scraps, soul food cooks saw Sunday dinner, and with a little patience, they made it unforgettable. The beauty of neckbones lies in their hidden richness. Though bony and tough at first glance, they're loaded with flavor when cooked low and slow. The preparation was deceptively simple. Season the bones, brown them in a skillet, then let them simmer for hours in a pot with onions, garlic, and enough water to draw out every ounce of marrow and meat. What began as a pot of odds and ends turned into a silky, savory gravy that begged to be ladled over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits. It was food that stuck to your ribs, food that made you close your eyes after the first bite. In many homes, neck bones and gravy were more than just dinner. They were a lesson in resourcefulness. Children grew up learning that nothing was wasted, that flavor often lived in the parts of the animal no one else wanted. Gathering around a table with a steaming plate of neck bones was about more than eating. It was about honoring the wisdom of making much from little. Today, you'll find foodies raving about short ribs or bone marrow butter, paying top dollar for the very idea of what neck bones always offered: depth, richness, and comfort. Back then, it wasn't called gourmet. It was just getting dinner on the table. The difference is that our grandparents didn't need a Michelin star to tell them what tasted good. Neck bones and gravy endure in memory because they remind us of how soulful food is at its best. Economical, deeply flavorful, and served with pride. One spoonful of that gravy, and suddenly you're home again, no matter where you are. Pig's feet. Few dishes embody the ingenuity of soul food quite like pig's feet. At first glance, they hardly seem like a prize at the butcher's counter, bony, gelatinous, and far removed from the glamorous cuts of pork that make headlines. But in kitchens across the South, pig's feet were transformed into something hearty, flavorful, and deeply comforting. They were a lesson in frugality and a reminder that with patience and creativity, even the humblest part of the hog could become a meal worth celebrating. Cooking pig's feet was never a quick affair. They had to be scrubbed and cleaned thoroughly before being dropped into a pot to simmer low and slow. Onion, garlic, bay leaves, and a splash of vinegar often joined them, filling the kitchen with a savory, slightly tangy aroma. The long cooking process coaxed every bit of gelatin from the bones, creating a sticky, rich broth that clung to your lips and begged for cornbread to sop it up. Served braised, pickled, or smothered in sauce, pig's feet carried a flavor that was bold, earthy, and unlike anything else. For many families, pig's feet weren't just food, they were an event. They were the centerpiece of weekend gatherings or holiday spreads, especially in communities where every part of the hog was honored and used. Eating them wasn't delicate. It was hands-on, a communal act of gnawing and savoring. Elders would chuckle at children's first hesitant bites, reminding them that this was food that had sustained generations. It was less about elegance and more about tradition, about being connected to something larger than the meal itself. Today, pig's feet straddle two worlds. On one hand, they've become rarities in many grocery stores, dismissed by modern shoppers who gravitate toward convenience cuts. On the other, they're showing up in high-end restaurants, praised for their collagen-rich texture and old-world authenticity. What once cost pennies can now command a gourmet price tag, proving once again that yesterday's necessity is often tomorrow's delicacy. Still, for those who remember, pig's feet aren't just a trend. They're a taste of home, a reminder of resilience, and proof that soul food has always been about finding richness where others saw none. Oxtails. There was a time when oxtails were the very definition of poor man's food. Butchers practically gave them away, treating them as scraps hardly worth the trouble of trimming. Yet in soul food kitchens, these tails became the centerpiece of meals that could make the whole house smell like heaven. With their marrow-rich bones and tender meat that clings stubbornly until coaxed free by long, slow cooking, oxtails turned necessity into luxury, even if no one realized it back then. Preparing oxtails was never about speed. First, they were seasoned generously and browned to a deep, rich crust. Then came the slow simmer, often with onions, celery, carrots, garlic, and sometimes beans or potatoes, depending on what the pantry allowed. Hours passed as the meat softened and the broth thickened into a glossy, savory gravy that clung to rice or cornbread. The marrow worked its quiet magic, infusing the dish with an almost silky richness that couldn't be faked. Eating it required patience too, pulling every tender bite from around the bones, savoring what felt like hidden treasure with each mouthful. In many households, oxtails were a meal of togetherness. They stretched across the table, bringing families close as everyone dug in, spoons scraping gravy, laughter rising between bites. They were also a lesson in appreciation. Nothing was wasted, and every part of the animal had its value. What began as survival food soon became a dish people looked forward to, a reminder that true comfort rarely comes from extravagance, but from meals made with care and time. Ironically, the humble oxtail has now gone upscale. What once cost pennies a pound now fetches gourmet prices in restaurants and specialty markets. Foodies praise the very qualities our grandparents took for granted: the gelatinous richness, the depth of flavor, the slow-cooked tenderness. It's proof that soul food wisdom was ahead of its time, seeing worth where others saw waste. For those who grew up with oxtails, the trendiness doesn't change their essence. They remain a dish steeped in memory, resilience, and flavor. One that connects the present to a past where thrift and creativity made magic out of the simplest cuts. Black-eyed peas with ham hock. Few dishes carry as much symbolism on the table as a pot of black-eyed peas with ham hock. In the South, they aren't just food, they're tradition, folklore, and comfort all simmered together in one humble pot. On New Year's Day especially, black-eyed peas have long been eaten for good luck, with the ham hock representing prosperity and the peas themselves standing in for coins. But beyond the superstition, this dish is a testament to the creativity and resilience that defined soul food cooking. The roots of black-eyed peas stretch back to West Africa, where the legume was a staple before it made its way across the Atlantic. Once in America, it became central to enslaved communities' diets, both for its affordability and its nourishment. Add in a ham hock, often the leftover or unwanted cut from a butchered hog, and suddenly a pot of beans became something hearty, smoky, and sustaining. This was everyday food, designed to stretch, to feed families with little, and to taste far better than its frugal ingredients suggested. The preparation was beautifully simple. Dried peas were soaked, then simmered slowly with onion, garlic, spices, and, of course, the ham hock, which infused every bite with a deep, smoky richness. As the peas softened, the broth thickened, turning into something between a soup and a stew. Ladled over rice or served alongside cornbread, it was the kind of meal that warmed you twice. Once in the kitchen as the aroma drifted through the house, and again at the table when you took that first spoonful. For many, this dish is inseparable from memory. It's the taste of Sunday dinners, of New Year's gatherings, of grandparents reminding children to eat their peas for luck. It's also a lesson in making the most of what was available, proving that thrift doesn't have to mean blandness. Today, black-eyed peas with ham hock may not be a regular weeknight meal, but it still appears when people want a taste of tradition. Whether it's for good fortune or just good flavor, the dish remains a symbol of resilience and hope. Simple ingredients woven into a story of survival and celebration. Turnip greens with pot liquor. In the world of soul food, nothing is ever wasted. Not time, not effort, and certainly not flavor. That truth is best embodied in a steaming pot of turnip greens with pot liquor, the kind of dish that carried entire families through leaner times. At first glance, turnip greens themselves might not seem glamorous. They're sturdy, slightly bitter leaves that many modern cooks might pass over in favor of kale or spinach. But when simmered low and slow, especially with the right seasoning and a meaty ham hock or a piece of salt pork, those greens transform into something nourishing, soulful, and deeply satisfying. The real treasure, though, was never just the greens. It was the pot liquor, that rich, savory broth left behind after hours of simmering. Infused with the essence of the greens, the smoky depth of pork, and the gentle heat of spices, pot liquor was liquid gold in the kitchen. Families would pour it into cups to sip like soup, sop it up with cornbread, or save it for another meal. Elders swore by its health benefits too, calling it the place where all the vitamins live. What some might dismiss as cooking water became, in the hands of resourceful cooks, a meal in its own right. For generations, turnip greens with pot liquor were about more than nourishment. They were about resilience and respect for every scrap that the earth and the hog provided. Around the dinner table, bowls of greens carried with them stories of survival, ingenuity, and a kind of flavor that money couldn't buy. They were a reminder that soul food wasn't about extravagance. It was about turning simplicity into sustenance and finding pride in thrift. Today, the phrase pot liquor might sound old-fashioned, but the idea behind it has crept back into culinary circles under different names. Chef's bottle broths, bone stocks, and detox tonics charging top dollar for what our grandparents made for pennies. Yet for those who grew up with a cup of pot liquor warming their hands, no trendy label could ever capture its true value. It was comfort, memory, and wisdom, simmered down in one humble pot. Collard greens with fatback. Few aromas can rival the comforting smell of collard greens slowly simmering away on the stove, their sturdy leaves breaking down into tender bites of smoky, savory goodness. For many households across the South, collard greens with fatback weren't just a side dish. They were a tradition, an unshakable part of Sunday dinners, church gatherings, and holiday feasts. Where modern diets might praise kale smoothies and spinach salads, collards stood as the original green superfood, though in soul food kitchens they rarely showed up without a little pork to guide them along. Fatback, that thick slab of cured pork taken from the back of the hog, was the secret to transforming collards from bitter greens into something irresistible. Dropped into a simmering pot, it released both flavor and fat, infusing every bite of collard with a richness that plain seasoning could never achieve. The cooking process was unhurried. A big pot of greens, a chunk of fatback, a little onion, maybe a splash of vinegar or hot sauce toward the end. Hours later, the pot yielded not only tender greens, but a broth so flavorful it was honored with its own name, pot liquor. That liquid was sopped up with cornbread or even sipped straight, considered both a treat and a tonic. The dish was born out of necessity, like so much of soul food. Collard greens were inexpensive, abundant, and resilient in the field, and fatback was one of the few cuts of pork reliably available to those who couldn't afford hams or roasts. Together, they created a meal that was not only sustaining, but deeply flavorful. Around the table, collard greens with fatback carried more than nutrients. They carried memories, lessons in thrift, and the satisfaction of eating something born from resilience. Today, collard greens remain iconic in soul food, though modern cooks sometimes swap the fatback for smoked turkey to cut the grease. Still, the essence remains unchanged. A pot of greens cooked low and slow until tender, served with pride. In every bowl lies a story of survival, family, and the timeless wisdom that good food doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs patience, love, and maybe a little pork. Pinto beans with cornbread? Sometimes the simplest meals are the ones that linger longest in memory. Pinto beans with cornbread was never meant to be fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was dependable, filling, and always within reach of families who had more mouths to feed than dollars in their pockets. A pot of beans could stretch across several meals, and a pan of cornbread, baked golden in a cast iron skillet, made sure nobody left the table hungry. Together, they formed one of the most enduring soul food pairings. Humble on the surface, but rich with history and meaning. Pinto beans, inexpensive and shelf-stable, became a staple in households where frugality was a necessity. Once soaked and simmered, they transformed into a creamy, hearty stew that carried layers of flavor depending on what seasonings were on hand. A ham hock, some fatback, or even just a sprinkle of onion and garlic could elevate the whole pot. The beans themselves absorbed every bit of seasoning, turning into a dish that was both comforting and deeply satisfying. But beans alone didn't make the meal. Cornbread was their faithful partner, ready to soak up the broth or pot liquor that gathered at the bottom of the bowl. Whether baked plain, sweetened with sugar, or studded with bits of cracklins, cornbread gave the meal its balance. One bite of beans followed by a piece of cornbread wasn't just nourishment. It was the taste of tradition, the kind of food that reminded you of home no matter where you ate it. For many families, this dish wasn't reserved for special occasions. It was weeknight food, dependable and unfussy, yet it carried the same weight of love and care as any holiday spread. Around the table, children learned that thrift didn't mean going without. It meant finding comfort and flavor in what you had. Today, pinto beans and cornbread may not headline restaurant menus, but they remain a quiet classic. In a world filled with fast food and meal kits, there's something grounding about a pot of beans simmering all day and a skillet of cornbread cooling on the counter. Together, they remind us that soul food's greatest strength has always been its simplicity. Cracklin bread. There's cornbread, and then there's cracklin bread. The cornbread's bolder, crunchier cousin that never walked quietly into a meal. For generations, this southern staple took something as simple as cornmeal and gave it an upgrade with bits of fried pork skin, or cracklins, folded right into the batter. The result was rustic and hearty, a dish that turned a side of bread into the main attraction. In many ways, cracklin bread was the ultimate soul food invention. Frugal, flavorful, and impossible to forget once you tasted it. The origins of cracklin bread are as practical as they are delicious. In hog killing season, nothing went to waste. The skin was rendered down into crispy cracklins, which were often saved and used later to flavor beans, green, or when there was a little extra to spare, mixed into cornbread batter. What might have started as an experiment quickly became a favorite. The cracklins added bursts of salty richness and a crunchy texture that stood out against the soft, crumbly cornbread. It was food that made you stop mid-bite and appreciate the genius of thrift. The process of making it was straightforward but full of anticipation. Cornmeal, a touch of flour, buttermilk, eggs, and lard came together to form the base. Once the batter was poured into a sizzling hot cast iron skillet, the cracklins were folded in, ensuring each slice was studded with crispy treasures. Baked until golden, the bread emerged with an aroma that filled the kitchen, promising a meal that was both humble and indulgent. For families, cracklin bread was more than a side dish. It was a taste of celebration, a reward after hard work, and a reminder that soul food thrived on creativity. Elders often spoke of it with fondness, recalling suppers where beans or greens were served alongside thick slices, each bite enhanced by the salty crunch within. Today, cracklin bread is harder to find outside of dedicated soul food kitchens or family gatherings, but its spirit lives on. In an age where chefs talk about texture and umami, our grandparents already had it figured out with a handful of pork cracklins and a skillet of cornbread. It was, and still is, soul food ingenuity at its finest. Hoppin John. Hoppin John is one of those dishes that wears two hats. It's both an everyday comfort and a ceremonial meal steeped in tradition. At its heart, it's a simple combination of black-eyed peas, rice, and a bit of pork for seasoning, but in soul food kitchens across the South, it has always been more than the sum of its parts. For generations, families served Hoppin John on New Year's Day with the belief that eating it would bring good luck and prosperity in the year ahead. The peas symbolized coins, the rice abundance, and the pork a sign of moving forward, since pigs root ahead rather than backward. Folklore aside, the dish has remained a beloved staple for its flavor and practicality. The roots of Hoppin John trace back to West Africa, where rice and beans were common partners in the cooking pot. Enslaved Africans carried this tradition to the American South, where it blended with local ingredients and became a cornerstone of low-country cuisine, particularly in South Carolina and Georgia. Over time, the dish spread beyond coastal regions and became firmly planted in the canon of soul food, proving that simple ingredients could hold deep cultural significance. Preparation was always accessible to those with limited means. A pot of dried peas or cowpeas was simmered slowly with an onion, a bit of fatback or ham hock, and spices until tender, then ladled over rice. The result was a dish that was smoky, earthy, and comforting, the kind of food that filled stomachs and stretched resources without ever feeling skimpy. Cornbread or collard greens often joined the table, completing a meal that was as nourishing to the spirit as it was to the body. For many families, memories of Hoppin John are tied to gatherings where laughter and chatter spilled across the table. It was the dish that marked a fresh start each year, a culinary blessing for the days to come. Today, it remains a dish that bridges past and present. In a world of trendy grain bowls and fast casual rice shops, Hoppin John stands as a reminder that soul food had its own bowls of comfort long before they became fashionable. Salmon croquettes. Few dishes embody the balance of thrift and flavor quite like salmon croquettes. They were the kind of meal that could appear on the table in a hurry, born from a can of salmon tucked away in the pantry and transformed into something golden, crispy, and deeply satisfying. For families who didn't have access to fresh fish, especially those far from rivers or coasts, canned salmon was a godsend. Affordable, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, it became a staple of soul food kitchens, and croquettes were its most beloved form. The preparation was as straightforward as it was ingenious. The canned salmon, bones and all, was flaked apart, mixed with onion, eggs, breadcrumbs, or cornmeal, and seasoned with whatever was at hand. Sometimes a little hot sauce, sometimes a sprinkle of parsley. The mixture was shaped into patties and fried in a cast iron skillet until crisp and brown on the outside, tender on the inside. The smell alone could summon children to the table, eager to bite into that crunchy crust and soft, savory center. Paired with grits for breakfast or rice for dinner, salmon croquettes proved that economy didn't have to mean compromise. Beyond their practicality, salmon croquettes carried a sense of comfort and familiarity. They were a weekday standby, a dish that mothers and grandmothers could count on to stretch a can of fish into a full meal for a hungry family. They were also portable, easy to pack into a lunch or slip into a sandwich, making them versatile long before meal prep became a trend. The dish reflected the kind of everyday ingenuity that defined soul food, taking what was available and elevating it into something memorable. Today, salmon croquettes are less likely to appear in modern kitchens, crowded out by fast food or more glamorous seafood dishes. Yet, for those who remember them, they remain a taste of home, a reminder of evenings gathered around the table with the skillet of croquettes disappearing faster than they could be fried. In truth, they deserve a revival, not just as a nostalgic recipe, but as a timeless example of how resourceful cooking can create lasting comfort. Fried catfish. There's a certain kind of joy that comes from biting into a piece of fried catfish. The golden crust shattering to reveal tender, flaky meat beneath. For many families across the South, this wasn't just dinner. It was a ritual, a community event, and sometimes even a fundraiser. The humble catfish, once pulled from muddy rivers and ponds, became one of the crown jewels of soul food cuisine when dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried to perfection in hot oil. The dish's roots run deep in African American cooking traditions, especially in regions where fishing was both livelihood and sustenance. Catfish was plentiful, inexpensive, and easy to catch, which made it accessible to families who might not have had the means for more expensive meats. Once coated in a mixture of cornmeal, flour, salt, pepper, and often a whisper of cayenne, the fish was slid into sizzling cast iron skillets or large outdoor fryers. The result was crispy on the outside, moist on the inside, and packed with flavor that needed no embellishment beyond a squeeze of lemon or a dash of hot sauce. Fried catfish was rarely eaten in solitude. It thrived in the company of others, showing up at church fish fries, family reunions, and community gatherings where the smell of frying oil carried down the street like an invitation. Alongside hush puppies, coleslaw, or collard greens, it became part of a spread that was as much about fellowship as it was about food. Memories of folding chairs under shade trees, laughter ringing out, and plates loaded with fried catfish linger as sweetly as the flavor itself. Though catfish is still eaten today, it doesn't hold quite the same place in everyday life. Farm-raised catfish made its way into supermarkets, but the communal spirit of frying up a fresh catch isn't as common as it once was. Modern diners might gravitate towards salmon fillets or tilapia, but those who grew up with fried catfish know that few meals can rival its combination of simplicity, flavor, and shared experience. To eat it is to taste a piece of tradition, a reminder that some of the best meals in life come not from fancy recipes, but from a well-seasoned skillet and a crowd of hungry friends. Smothered pork chops. Few dishes capture the essence of comfort food quite like smothered pork chops. The name alone tells you what to expect. Tender pork chops simmered low and slow beneath a blanket of rich onion gravy, so flavorful and indulgent that it demands a side of rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits to soak up every drop. In the world of soul food, smothered pork chops represented not just a hearty dinner, but a lesson in resourcefulness, stretching simple cuts of meat into a meal that felt luxurious, even when money was tight. The beauty of the dish lies in its transformation. Pork chops, often an affordable cut, could easily become tough or dry if cooked too quickly. But when seared in a cast iron skillet and then simmered gently in a gravy made from onions, flour, broth, and sometimes a touch of cream, they became fork tender, infused with savory flavor at every bite. The gravy was the star, thick and soulful, turning plain rice or cornbread into something worth savoring. For many families, it was the kind of meal that signaled the end of a long workday, a promise that the kitchen would always be a place of comfort. Smothered pork chops also carried a certain pride. They were a dish you could serve to guests without shame. Hearty enough for Sunday supper, yet simple enough for a weekday. The aroma of onions caramelizing and gravy thickening would fill the house, drawing everyone to the table before the skillet even left the stove. Paired with greens, candied yams, or macaroni and cheese, the plate became a complete reflection of Southern hospitality and ingenuity. Today, smothered pork chops may not appear as often in busy kitchens, nudged aside by quicker weeknight options or leaner cuts of meat. But for those who grew up with them, they are a reminder of home, of sitting at the table where seconds were always offered and nobody left hungry. In a culinary world obsessed with trends, smothered pork chops remind us that some classics don't need updating. A skillet, some onions, and a little patience are all it takes to bring back the taste of comfort that never truly went out of style. Chicken and dumplings. If ever there were a dish that could soothe the soul on a cold night or after a long day, it would be chicken and dumplings. This humble bowl of comfort has roots in both Southern kitchens and Depression-era frugality, where nothing from a bird went to waste and a pot of broth could be stretched into something hearty enough to feed a family. The magic of chicken and dumplings lies in its simplicity. Tender pieces of chicken stewed until they practically fall apart, floating in a rich broth thickened by flour or milk, all crowned with soft dumplings that cook right in the pot. It's not fancy, but it is the kind of food that feels like a hug from the inside out. Traditionally, the dish began with an old hen or leftover chicken parts, simmered low and slow to create a deeply flavorful stock. Onions, carrots, and celery often made their way into the pot, but the star was always the dumplings. Depending on the cook, dumplings could be fluffy biscuit-like rounds dropped straight into the bubbling broth or flat noodle-like strips rolled thin and cut from simple dough. Both had their devotees, and both soaked up the savory flavors of the stew while adding bulk that made the dish stretch further. For families watching their budgets, dumplings were a brilliant way to turn a modest amount of chicken into a meal that could fill everyone's belly. The dish wasn't just economical, it was emotional. Many people remember bowls of chicken and dumplings served at Sunday suppers, family gatherings, or when someone needed a little extra comfort during hard times. The steam rising from the pot, the rich aroma of chicken broth, and the anticipation of tearing into those pillowy dumplings created an atmosphere of warmth that went beyond the food itself. In today's fast-paced world, chicken and dumplings might seem like a time-consuming relic, but it's experiencing a quiet revival. Home cooks are rediscovering the power of slow simmering, of letting dough and broth do their work, and of sitting down with the meal that demands you pause and savor. In every spoonful is a taste of resilience, resourcefulness, and love, the kind of nourishment that never goes out of fashion. Gizzards and gravy. When it comes to soul food, few dishes spark as much debate as gizzards and gravy. Some folks wrinkle their noses at the mention, while others smile knowingly, remembering the rich aroma of a skillet filled with these humble morsels simmering away. Gizzards, the muscular part of a chicken's stomach, were often overlooked cuts that came cheap, or sometimes free, making them a staple in kitchens that had to stretch every dollar. But what some saw as scraps, others transformed into pure comfort. With patience and a good hand for seasoning, gizzards cooked down until tender could rival any prized cut of meat, especially when paired with a silky, savory gravy. The preparation was as much about technique as ingredients. Gizzards, tough by nature, needed long, slow cooking to become tender. Many cooks started by boiling them gently in seasoned water until they softened, then dredged them in flour and pan-fried for texture, before finally simmering them in a rich onion gravy. That gravy was the real secret. A blend of pan drippings, flour, and broth whisked together until it clung to every bite. Served over rice, mashed potatoes, or hot buttered biscuits, the dish became not just sustenance, but a feast. It was the kind of meal that made you forget these cuts were ever considered less than. Culturally, gizzards and gravy tell a story of resilience and resourcefulness. For many African American families, these parts of the bird were what was available, and ingenuity turned them into something special. Gathering around a table with plates of gizzards smothered in gravy wasn't just about eating. It was about honoring the tradition of making the most of what you had and doing it with flavor. Today, gizzards still spark curiosity in modern kitchens. While some fast food chains fry them as a snack, the slow-simmered version with gravy remains a nostalgic dish tied to memory and tradition. In an era when nose-to-tail cooking is suddenly trendy, soul food reminds us that this practice isn't new at all. It's been around for generations. Gizzards and gravy prove that with a little time, love, and seasoning, even the humblest cuts can shine like a star on the dinner table. Gumbo with whatever was on hand. If there is one dish that perfectly captures the spirit of making do with what you have, it's gumbo. This Louisiana classic has always been less about following a strict recipe and more about throwing whatever was on hand into the pot and trusting the flavors to come together. Born out of cultural blending, West African, French, Spanish, and Native American influences all simmering in one pot, gumbo became a symbol of resilience and creativity, especially in hard times when money was scarce and resources even scarcer. Families could stretch a little bit of meat, a few vegetables, and some rice into a dish hearty enough to feed a crowd. And that flexibility made gumbo as practical as it was delicious. The foundation of gumbo was always the roux, that deeply browned mixture of flour and fat stirred patiently until it took on the color of chocolate. Into that base went whatever was available: chicken backs, smoked sausage, leftover ham bones, or scraps of seafood if the catch was good. Okra, prized for both its flavor and its ability to thicken, often appeared in the pot, along with the holy trinity of onions, bell peppers, and celery. Rice was the great equalizer, stretching every ladle of gumbo into a filling meal. No two pots were exactly alike, and that was the beauty of it. It was a dish that reflected both the cook's pantry and the moment in history. For many families, gumbo wasn't just food, it was an event. Pots large enough to feed entire neighborhoods bubbled on stoves, filling kitchens with a smell that drew people in from the porch and the street. It was a dish for sharing, for celebrating survival, and for reminding each other that community mattered most when times were lean. In today's kitchens, gumbo still holds its place as a soulful favorite. Some chefs guard their recipes like treasure, while others continue the tradition of improvisation. And maybe that's the real heart of gumbo. It teaches us that good cooking isn't about perfection, but about using what you've got, stirring with care, and letting patience transform scraps into sustenance. Every pot tells a story, and every spoonful carries history. Okra stew. Okra stew is one of those dishes that immediately connects the table to a long history of survival, adaptation, and flavor. Brought to the Americas through the African diaspora, okra quickly became a cornerstone of Southern and soul food cooking, prized for its ability to stretch a pot and create hearty, filling meals with minimal ingredients. The stew itself was often born out of necessity, when meat was scarce and vegetables had to carry the meal. With okra's unique texture and its natural thickening power, families could turn a handful of vegetables, some broth, and maybe a scrap of smoked meat into a dish that fed everyone with comfort and warmth. Traditionally, okra stew might start with onions, tomatoes, and peppers sizzling in a skillet, sometimes with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock for depth of flavor. Then, in went the okra, sliced into rounds, its juices slowly mingling with the rest of the pot to create that signature silky consistency. Corn or beans might be added if they were on hand, each variation reflecting what the cook had available. The stew was often ladled over rice or eaten with cornbread, making it filling enough to sustain hard-working families through long days in the fields or factories. But beyond the ingredients, okra stew carried emotional weight. It was a reminder of roots, African roots, where okra was beloved long before it ever grew in southern soil, and familial roots, as recipes were passed down from grandmothers who could coax flavor from the humblest pantry. It was also a dish that brought people together, simmering in big pots during family gatherings or Sunday dinners, when food was less about luxury and more about love. Today, okra stew doesn't show up as often in glossy cookbooks or restaurant menus, but its story remains powerful. In a world obsessed with convenience and pre-packaged meals, okra stew reminds us of the ingenuity of earlier generations who turned garden harvests and scraps into soul-satisfying dishes. For those who still make it, every bite carries both nostalgia and pride. A celebration of resilience, simmered down into a simple, hearty bowl. Rice pudding. Rice pudding is one of those timeless dishes that proves comfort doesn't need extravagance. At its heart, it is nothing more than leftover rice simmered with milk, sugar, and a touch of spice, but in the hands of resourceful cooks, it became something far greater. For many families, especially in the South, rice pudding was a way to stretch the most humble pantry staples into a sweet ending for a long day's work. It was born out of thrift, transforming what might otherwise be tossed aside into a dessert that could make children smile and adults pause for just a little moment of indulgence. The preparation was as straightforward as it was forgiving. Day-old rice went into a pot with milk, sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, and a bit of sugar. Cinnamon or nutmeg was often added if the spice jar had anything left to give. Some cooks would slip in raisins or bits of dried fruit for extra sweetness, while others topped it with a drizzle of sorghum or molasses. What resulted was a dish that was creamy, fragrant, and endlessly adaptable. Rice pudding could be served warm, spooned straight from the pot on a chilly night, or chilled in the icebox for a cool treat in the summer. Beyond the simplicity of its ingredients, rice pudding carried a sense of comfort that went deeper than taste. It was a dessert tied to memory, the kind that might appear at church suppers, family gatherings, or quietly at the end of a weekday meal when there wasn't much else to offer. In lean times, when treats were rare, rice pudding felt like a luxury even though it came from scraps. It was food that said, "We may not have much, but we can still have something sweet together." In today's kitchens, rice pudding has taken on new life. Trendy versions pop up flavored with coconut milk, cardamom, or even espresso. But at its core, it remains the same dish that comforted generations. It's a reminder that some of the best desserts don't come from complicated recipes or fancy ingredients, but from the creativity of turning leftovers into something worth savoring. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce is one of those desserts that proves the old saying true: waste not, want not. At its foundation, this dish was born from frugality, a way to give stale bread new life rather than letting it go to the chickens or compost heap. Families would gather up leftover loaves, biscuits, or cornbread, soak them in a custard of milk, eggs, sugar, and spice, and bake until the kitchen smelled like comfort itself. What emerged was a dessert that was both practical and indulgent, transforming scraps into something rich, warm, and celebratory. The base of bread pudding was always adaptable. Some cooks used cinnamon and nutmeg. Others slipped in dried fruit, nuts, or even a splash of molasses for extra sweetness. The texture, too, was a matter of taste. Some preferred it soft and custardy, while others baked it longer for a firmer bite. But no matter the variation, it was the sauce that truly set it apart. Whiskey sauce, poured generously over the pudding while still warm, gave the dish its unmistakable southern soul. A mixture of butter, sugar, cream, and a hearty glug of whiskey, the sauce turned an already comforting dessert into something worthy of holidays, church socials, or any gathering where a little extra indulgence was called for. Emotionally, bread pudding with whiskey sauce represented more than just dessert. It was a testament to resilience, the art of turning nothing into something with a dash of ingenuity. For families who struggled through lean times, it was a reminder that celebration didn't have to cost much, just a few pantry staples and a willingness to make do. And for those who grew up with it, the first bite often brings back memories of crowded kitchens, laughter, and the clink of spoons against bowls. Today, bread pudding has earned its place in restaurants and cookbooks, sometimes dressed up with chocolate, caramel, or exotic spices. Yet the essence remains unchanged. A dessert born of thrift, transformed by flavor, and perfected by a drizzle of whiskey sauce. Each serving carries both nostalgia and richness, proof that the simplest ingredients can yield the sweetest rewards. Peach cobbler. Peach cobbler is the kind of dessert that carries the warmth of summer in every bite, even if you're eating it in the dead of winter. At its heart, cobbler is a dish born of simplicity and necessity, crafted by cooks who wanted to capture the fleeting sweetness of ripe peaches and stretch them into something that could feed a family. Unlike the polished elegance of a pie with its perfectly crimped crust, cobbler has always been the more rustic cousin, easy to prepare, forgiving in form, yet no less satisfying. It's the dish that reminds us that comfort often comes in imperfect packages. The earliest versions of cobbler were often put together by layering sweetened peaches, sometimes fresh and sometimes canned, in a baking dish and topping them with dough or biscuit batter. As it baked, the fruit bubbled up through the golden crust, creating that irresistible marriage of juicy filling and tender, slightly crisp topping. A sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg added warmth, while a scoop of ice cream or a drizzle of cream, if the household could spare it, made the dish feel like pure luxury. Beyond its flavors, peach cobbler became a staple at family gatherings, church socials, and Sunday suppers, often made in large pans so everyone could have a scoop. It was the kind of dessert that didn't require fussing, yet always managed to bring people together. For many, the memory of peach cobbler isn't just about the taste. It's about the smell of fruit and sugar caramelizing in the oven, the chatter of relatives around the table, and the comfort of knowing dessert was on the way. In today's kitchens, peach cobbler has held on to its beloved place, even as variations have appeared with oats, different fruits, or fancier pastry techniques. But its spirit remains unchanged. A dessert that thrives on abundance, whether from a backyard orchard or a can pulled from the pantry. peach cobbler is proof that food doesn't have to be elaborate to feel special. Sometimes, all you need is fruit, dough, and the patience to let it bake into something that tastes like home. Sweet potato pie. Sweet potato pie is one of those desserts that feels like it was designed to taste like home. Rooted deeply in Southern kitchens, it has long been a staple of African American cooking, carrying with it centuries of tradition and resilience. Unlike pumpkin pie, which became the darling of glossy magazines and holiday spreads, sweet potato pie remained a quiet hero of family tables and Sunday dinners. It was born of practicality. Sweet potatoes were plentiful, easy to grow, and inexpensive. But when baked into a silky custard, seasoned with warm spices and tucked into a flaky crust, they transformed into something extraordinary. The pie itself is simple, yet profound. Mashed sweet potatoes are blended with eggs, milk or evaporated milk, sugar, and a touch of butter, then flavored with cinnamon, nutmeg, or vanilla. Each household has its own variations. Some prefer it lighter and airy, while others insist on a denser, almost pudding-like texture. Unlike its pumpkin cousin, sweet potato pie carries a natural sweetness and depth of flavor that doesn't need much adornment. The result is a pie that tastes earthy yet indulgent, with a caramel-like richness that lingers on the tongue. Sweet potato pie is more than just dessert. It's a cultural touchstone. For many African American families, it holds a place of honor at holiday gatherings, especially Thanksgiving and Christmas. Its presence on the table is as much about identity as it is about flavor. A dish that whispers of survival, ingenuity, and community. Grandmothers and mothers passed down their recipes not just in written notes, but by teaching in the kitchen, showing how much spice was enough and how to judge doneness by the wobble of the filling. Today, sweet potato pie has begun to receive the recognition it deserves, often standing proudly alongside pumpkin pie rather than in its shadow. Yet for those who grew up with it, the appeal goes beyond trendiness. It's the memory of peeling potatoes by hand, the smell of cinnamon filling the kitchen, and the satisfaction of slicing into a pie that connects generations. Sweet potato pie is proof that the humblest ingredients, when treated with care, can become the most treasured traditions. Molasses cake. Molasses cake is one of those desserts that harks back to a time when sweeteners were scarce luxuries, and families had to make do with what was available. Before refined white sugar was commonplace, molasses, dark, thick, and rich with a bittersweet edge, was the go-to ingredient for adding sweetness to baked goods. It was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and accessible to families across rural America, making it the backbone of many simple desserts. From the kitchens of enslaved cooks to the farmhouse tables of early settlers, molasses cake became a humble yet enduring symbol of resourcefulness and comfort. The cake itself is usually a straightforward affair, made with flour, butter or lard, eggs, and the star ingredient, molasses. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were often added, giving it that warm, aromatic flavor that fills a home with the kind of fragrance you can almost taste before the first bite. The result was a moist, dark cake that struck a perfect balance between sweetness and spice. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. A slice of molasses cake with a cup of coffee or a glass of milk was enough to satisfy a sweet craving at the end of a long day. Beyond flavor, molasses cake carried cultural weight. In many African American households, it tied directly to the legacy of slavery, when molasses was one of the few sweeteners allotted to enslaved people. Transforming it into something celebratory was an act of both necessity and creativity, turning scraps into a sense of dignity and joy. For farm families, molasses cake became a staple dessert, baked in sheet pans or iron skillets, ready to feed a crowd or stretch across several days. In the modern era, molasses cake may seem old-fashioned, overshadowed by frosted layer cakes and trendier confections. Yet it has a timeless appeal, especially for those who crave desserts that aren't cloyingly sweet, but instead carry depth and character. Its rich, spiced flavor feels especially right in autumn or winter, when the kitchen craves warmth. Every bite of molasses cake is like tasting history itself, a reminder that simple ingredients, treated with care, can leave behind a legacy far richer than their humble origins. Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie is one of those desserts that perfectly illustrates the ingenuity of old-fashioned cooks who refuse to let empty cupboards stop them from creating something sweet. It was a classic desperation pie, born in times when fruit was scarce, sugar was rationed, and store-bought luxuries were out of reach. Housewives and home cooks turned to vinegar, of all things, to mimic the tartness of lemon and pies. The result was a dish that seemed improbable on paper, but somehow worked beautifully in practice. A tangy, custard-like filling tucked into a flaky crust, transforming frugality into something surprisingly elegant. The basic recipe called for pantry staples: flour, sugar, eggs, butter, and vinegar. That was it. No exotic imports, no fancy extras, just the bare minimum dressed up with kitchen wisdom. The vinegar's acidity cut through the sweetness of the sugar, giving the pie a bright, almost citrus-like quality. Spices like nutmeg or cinnamon were sometimes added for warmth, but the charm of vinegar pie lay in its simplicity. It didn't pretend to be anything more than what it was, and yet it managed to hold its own against more glamorous desserts. This pie carried more than just flavor. It carried hope. During the Great Depression or wartime rationing, it represented a cook's determination to provide comfort in the face of scarcity. Families gathered around the table, slicing into a pie that symbolized resilience and the belief that even meager ingredients could bring joy. For many, vinegar pie became more than dessert. It was proof that resourcefulness could be delicious. Today, vinegar pie feels like a relic from another era, overshadowed by fruit tarts and chocolate creations. Yet when revived in modern kitchens, it has a certain novelty, part conversation piece, part culinary time machine. It reminds us that great cooking isn't always about abundance, but about imagination. A slice of vinegar pie connects us back to the wisdom of those who came before, who found sweetness in unexpected places. It may not win any bake-off for glamour, but one taste is enough to understand why it lingered in old cookbooks. It's proof that thrift and creativity can yield something extraordinary. Chess pie. Chess pie is one of those desserts that feels deceptively simple, yet manages to capture the heart of Southern baking. At first glance, it doesn't seem like much. A single crust pie filled with a smooth golden custard made from the humblest of ingredients: eggs, sugar, butter, and a touch of cornmeal or flour. But that's the magic of chess pie. It takes what many would consider pantry basics and transforms them into a dessert that is rich, indulgent, and deeply tied to memory and tradition. The origins of chess pie are a little hazy, with some food historians tracing it back to English custard pies brought over by settlers. while others insist it is a purely Southern creation, born from resourcefulness. The name itself has long been debated. Some say it came from the phrase just pie being slurred into chess pie, while others suggest it might have been stored in pie chests, those wooden cupboards designed to keep baked goods safe from pests. Whatever its linguistic roots, what we do know is that chess pie became a beloved staple across the South, showing up at church socials, Sunday dinners, and holiday spreads. The filling is dense and sweet, with a slight graininess from the cornmeal that sets it apart from silkier custard pies. A splash of vinegar or lemon juice is often added to balance the sugar, giving it a subtle tang that keeps it from being cloying. Served warm or chilled, it slices beautifully, each wedge shining like a golden promise of comfort. Unlike fancier pies that rely on fruit or elaborate toppings, chess pie is unapologetically plain, and yet that plainness is exactly what makes it timeless. Culturally, chess pie is about more than taste. It represents the ingenuity of Southern cooks who could make something memorable from almost nothing. In a time when resources were limited, this pie became proof that a sweet ending to a meal didn't require extravagance. Today, it still shows up on Southern tables, often passed down from handwritten recipes tucked in family cookbooks. One bite is all it takes to understand why it has endured. It's sweet, sturdy, and steeped in history, much like the people who first baked it. Buttermilk pie. A buttermilk pie is one of those desserts that instantly transports you back to a grandmother's kitchen, where the oven was always working overtime and the air smelled faintly of vanilla and warm sugar. At its core, this pie is another example of desperation baking, a sweet treat born from necessity rather than extravagance. Much like chess pie, it relies on the simplest of ingredients: eggs, sugar, butter, and of course, tangy buttermilk, to create something that feels far greater than the sum of its parts. What makes buttermilk pie unique is that signature tartness from the buttermilk, which cuts through the sweetness and gives it a flavor profile that's both comforting and refreshing. The history of buttermilk pie is tied to Southern kitchens, where thrift and creativity went hand in hand. In times when fruit wasn't available and store-bought luxuries were out of reach, families turned to what they had. Buttermilk, a byproduct of churning butter, was often plentiful and cheap, so it became a staple in baking. Instead of letting it go to waste, cooks used it as the backbone of pies, cakes, and biscuits. In buttermilk pie, its acidity works double duty, flavoring the custard filling while also helping the pie set into a smooth, velvety texture. The preparation was straightforward: a single pie crust filled with a mixture of sugar, butter, eggs, a little flour, and buttermilk. Baked until the top turned golden with a slight crackle. Some cooks added a dusting of nutmeg or lemon zest for extra warmth, while others kept it plain and simple. No matter how it was dressed, the result was always the same: a creamy, custardy pie that could be eaten warm or chilled, served plain, or with a dollop of whipped cream if someone wanted to get fancy. Beyond its flavor, buttermilk pie carries with it a sense of resilience and ingenuity. It's proof that dessert doesn't require abundance, only a willingness to make do and create joy from what's on hand. Today, it may not appear as often on modern tables crowded with cheesecakes and layered confections, but every slice of buttermilk pie feels like a quiet reminder of simpler times: sweet, tangy, and enduring. Rice and gravy. Rice and gravy may not sound glamorous, but in countless Southern households, it was nothing short of a daily ritual. This dish wasn't about extravagance, it was about making the most of what you had and turning something humble into something deeply satisfying. At its heart, rice and gravy is a marriage of two frugal staples: plain white rice, filling and inexpensive, and gravy, born from the drippings of whatever meat happened to be on the stove that day. Together, they created a meal that was cheap, hearty, and capable of stretching one small portion of meat to feed an entire family. The roots of rice and gravy can be traced to both Southern and Creole cooking, where rice was already a staple crop and gravy making was an art form. Cooks saved every drop of rendered fat, whether from fried chicken, pork chops, or a Sunday roast, and whisked it with flour and broth to make a smooth, flavorful sauce. Sometimes onions or bell peppers were sautéed in the pan to add depth, and if someone was lucky enough to have garlic or a pinch of spice, it went in too. Poured generously over fluffy rice, the gravy turned an otherwise plain dish into something rich and soulful. There was no single recipe for rice and gravy. It was as versatile as the kitchens it came from. Some versions leaned brown and beefy, others creamy and chicken-based. In lean times, there might not even be much meat involved at all. Just the essence left in the pan coaxed into flavor. And yet, no one sitting at the table ever complained. The dish was filling, warm, and a comfort at the end of long workdays or church Sundays. More than just food, rice and gravy carried emotional weight. It was the dish that filled bellies without emptying pockets, the one that taught children the value of not wasting a thing, the one that brought families together over simple bowls of sustenance. Today, when we think of comfort food, rice and gravy deserves a spot at the top. It's living proof that sometimes the simplest meals leave the deepest impressions. Cornmeal mush, fried into cakes. Cornmeal mush may sound like something you'd scrape together in desperation, and in many ways, that's exactly what it was. Born out of necessity, this humble dish was a staple in poor households across the South and Midwest, where cornmeal was cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile. Families would cook it into a thick porridge by boiling cornmeal in water or milk, then letting it set into a firm loaf overnight. The next day, slices were cut and fried in a skillet until golden brown, transforming yesterday's mush into crispy, hearty cakes that could be eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. This dish has deep roots in both Native American food traditions and early American frontier cooking. Corn, after all, was the grain of survival, and mush was one of the simplest ways to stretch it. For African American families in the South, cornmeal mush was both a comfort and a necessity. It didn't require much, just cornmeal, water, and maybe a pinch of salt or fat if you had it on hand. Yet when fried into cakes, it took on a new life. Crunchy at the edges and soft inside. A satisfying bite that made you forget how little went into it. There were endless ways to dress it up depending on what a family could spare. Some drizzled it with molasses, honey, or sorghum for a sweet breakfast. Others topped it with gravy or served it alongside beans or greens for a filling dinner. Fried mush could even stand in for meat when money was scarce. A crispy golden patty offering the illusion of abundance on an otherwise bare table. For many who grew up eating it, cornmeal mush fried into cakes carries strong nostalgia. It speaks to resilience, to the kind of cooking that wastes nothing and transforms the simplest ingredients into something greater than itself. Today, it might strike some as old-fashioned or forgotten, But dishes like this are reminders of how creativity and thrift fed generations. In an age of expensive brunch plates and artisanal cornmeal, there's something grounding about fried mush cakes. Plain, practical, and still deeply comforting. Red beans and rice. Red beans and rice is one of those dishes that proves the best meals are often the simplest. With roots in New Orleans Creole cooking, this comforting staple was never about luxury. It was about making something hearty, flavorful, and communal out of the most modest ingredients. Mondays became synonymous with red beans and rice in Louisiana kitchens, thanks to an old rhythm of household chores. Wash day kept cooks busy, so a pot of beans simmering slowly on the back burner while laundry was scrubbed and hung out to dry was both practical and nourishing. By the evening, you had a meal that could feed a crowd without breaking the bank. At its heart, the dish is built on dried red beans, soaked overnight, and then cooked low and slow until tender. A ham hock, leftover bone, or sausage, whatever was available, would be added to give depth and smokiness. Onion, celery, and bell pepper, the holy trinity of Creole cooking, provided the aromatic backbone, and a handful of garlic or spice elevated the flavor further if a family had it on hand. Ladled generously over fluffy white rice, the beans transformed from humble fare into something rich, creamy, and deeply satisfying. The beauty of red beans and rice lies in its adaptability. Some versions were meaty and robust, others leaned more on the beans themselves, stretching flavor from little more than a ham bone and ingenuity. Regardless of the variation, the result was always the same: a belly-filling meal that warmed both body and spirit. It wasn't just sustenance, it was tradition, an act of community and rhythm that tied families and neighborhoods together. Nostalgically, red beans and rice carries more than just flavor. It carries memory. It speaks of kitchens filled with steam, of grandmothers stirring wooden spoons, of kids eagerly waiting for dinner after long school days. And in today's fast-paced world of delivery apps and frozen dinners, it stands as a reminder of the value of slowing down, of meals that take time but reward patience. Red beans and rice may have begun as a practical necessity, but it has endured as a soulful emblem of comfort, heritage, and the art of making more with less. Stewed apples. Few dishes capture the quiet warmth of old-fashioned cooking quite like stewed apples. Long before store shelves overflowed with pre-packaged snacks and sugar-laden desserts, a simple pot of apples simmering on the stove was enough to sweeten the day. Stewed apples weren't about extravagance, they were about comfort, thrift, and making the most of what you had on hand. In many southern and rural kitchens, apples were a dependable staple, harvested in bulk and stored for the winter. When they started to soften or wrinkle, instead of being tossed, they were transformed into something tender, fragrant, and utterly satisfying. The preparation was as straightforward as it was brilliant. Peeled, cored, and sliced apples went into a pot with just a bit of water, maybe a knob of butter, and a dusting of sugar or drizzle of molasses if it could be spared. A sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg turned the mixture into a dessert that felt downright luxurious, even when made from fruit on its last leg. Cooked gently, the apples broke down into tender chunks or silky softness, depending on the cook's preference. Served warm, stewed apples were spooned over biscuits, ladled onto cornbread, or enjoyed on their own in a simple bowl. For families living through lean times, it was both frugal and nourishing, a way of stretching resources without sacrificing flavor. But stewed apples weren't just a thrifty dessert, they carried emotional weight. Their aroma filled kitchens with a scent that promised warmth and comfort, much like a hug from a loved one. They often appeared alongside pork chops or salt pork, their gentle sweetness balancing out savory dishes. For many, the memory of stewed apples is tied to grandparents who refused to waste a single piece of fruit, teaching resourcefulness through every simmering pot. In today's world of glossy pastries and instant sweets, stewed apples might seem quaint, even old-fashioned. Yet they offer something modern food often lacks: simplicity with soul. They remind us that not every dessert needs to be complicated or photogenic to be meaningful. A pot of apples bubbling on the stove still has the power to bring comfort, warmth, and a taste of the past straight to the present. And there you have it, 30 soul food classics that carried families through hard times and brought joy to countless tables. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves good food, and subscribe for more stories from the kitchens of the past. After all, keeping these forgotten dishes alive starts with us.